Hi guys, today we're going back in time. Okay, so we're going to go back to the beginning of period 4 around the turn of the century and talk to the end of period 4 about all the cultural stuff and the social stuff and religious things. So our lecture today is reforms and culture, and there's a huge push for reform during this time period. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different reformers and players there. Okay. The first thing we need to discuss, though, is the Second Great Awakening. So, the First Great Awakening happened before the Revolution, and it was all about churches breaking up into different denominations, the first mass social movement. It involved some African Americans and women. It also introduced democracy into the church system, where we have elders and deacons and we vote on them to represent us within the congregation. And that kind of spread some democratic reform. Now, the Second Great Awakening is more about social reform, and we'll get to why in a second. But essentially, before the Second Great Awakening, we still had lots of Americans attending church regularly, but there was more liberalism in thinking. Remember deism that was promoted by Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and others, and it was kind of like this Enlightenment science-y religion where God is a clockmaker and he made the world and stepped back. That it relies on reason more than revelation, on science more than scripture. And so that is still a liberal idea that's spreading from the upper class down to the other classes. And then Unitarianism is like another spin-off from Puritanism, essentially. It's the idea that there's no Trinity, that it's just God. So we don't have the Holy Spirit and Jesus Christ as well, and that there's free will, but your salvation is through your works. And so that good works should be spread throughout your community. And that is really one of the big parts of the Second Great Awakening, is spreading your religion through good works. So the Second Great Awakening itself is much like the first. It's a reaction against growing liberalism. In the First Great Awakening, it was a reaction against the Enlightenment. In this Great Awakening, it's kind of a reaction against the spreading of deism and Unitarianism. And it's more people going to church. It's big revivals. It's very emotional preaching and camp meetings and circuit preachers that go around and around and around to different communities and hold these lectures and preach. It's really one of the most momentous episodes in American religious history. It kind of starts in the South, but spreads its way up to New England, especially in the New York area. And it's much larger in scope than the First Great Awakening. We will see countless souls converted, shattered churches that reorganize into different denominations, and it will foster a bunch of new reform movements that we're going to talk about. So how did it spread? Much like the last, those circuit preachers, hellfire and brimstone, emotional preaching, camp meetings, and people fainting, and forgive me of my sins, and very public conversions and drama. And we have a few different players this time. Remember, it was Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield in the First Great Awakening. In the Second Great Awakening, your two names you need to remember is Peter Cartwright and Charles Grandison Finney. And the circuit preachers or circuit riders, they just go around from town to town, like I said, and they hold these huge revivals. And sometimes it's as many as 25,000 people camping out in a giant field, gathered for several days to hear a group of preachers preach this hellfire gospel. And the Methodists and the Baptists are the ones who really take hold of this. Both of those denominations really stress personal conversion and what you do to gain salvation. And within both of those denominations, the congregations are relatively democratic. They will elect elders and deacons into position, and those elders and deacons will hire preachers for their churches. And they're both very emotional in their preaching at this time. We've got this one very specific area in the Second Great Awakening in upstate New York, so not New York City, but like Western New York, called the Burnt Over District. It's many New England Puritans had settled there, and then the Great Awakening sweeps through, and it's known for its hellfire and damnation sermons, and it's like it's literally burnt over. Okay, there's so many people converted. There's so many churches that break up and reorganize that it is not the same at all afterward in this area in New York. And speaking of those religions breaking down into sects, we get a lot of new denominations. Adventists, which is one of my favorites, led by William Miller, interpreted the Bible to mean that there's a specific date that Jesus Christ will return, and it was supposed to be October 22nd, 1844. And the failure of Christ to appear that day did dampen Adventists, but didn't kill them out. So that religion was another denomination that broke off. We have Episcopalians and Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Unitarians that continue to break down into different little churches based on how they interpret the Bible or interpret faith. We have like wealthier, better educated levels of society weren't as affected by the revivalism, just like the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening much focuses on the lower classes. And then we've got the slavery issue now is a growing issue as we expand westward. And do we expand slavery as well? That's kind of a conversation in churches and at these revivals, and it kind of splits many churches. The Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians, they split along the lines of is slavery okay or is slavery not okay? Can we justify slavery with the Bible, or is slavery a sin? And Southern churches kind of break down into their own denominations because they obviously want to keep slavery. So, just like I said, the more educated, the upper classes are less affected. It mostly affects the lower classes who don't have as much access to education and reading the Bible for themselves and thinking for themselves like the upper classes do. And it's mostly in the South and West, except for that burnt over district in New York. All right. This one, that's a joke for Jonah. Jonah was a student of mine who loved the Broadway musical Book of Mormon. So one denomination that breaks away during the Second Great Awakening and becomes a giant denomination that's still around today is the Mormons, or the Seventh-day Adventists. Joseph Smith finds the Church of Latter-day Saints in 1830, and he writes the Book of Mormon after having experienced a revelation. God tells him that Jesus came to America and interacted with the natives here, and it's written down, and you just have to find it. And he has this religious conversion with these golden plates. It's quite a story. And he writes the Book of Mormon saying that it was God-breathed scripture, that God told him to write it, okay? And he finds this church in New York in the burnt over district. Well, the Mormons become persecuted there because of some of their interesting beliefs like polygamy, and that there's a new Bible called the Book of Mormon, and they get kicked out of there. They go to Ohio. They start getting persecuted in Ohio, then Missouri, then Illinois, and just the base of Bible believing Christians is much bigger than the base of Book of Mormon believing Christians, and they also believe in the Bible as well. And so they're kind of kicked out everywhere they go. In 1844, Joseph Smith and his brother are murdered and mangled by a mob in Illinois, and we need a new leader. And Brigham Young leads the Mormons to Salt Lake City in Utah. He says, we're not going to cut it here where these Bible-believing Christians are that don't believe in what we believe. Let's move out west where no one is. So they start this huge city, Salt Lake City, and it still has this huge presence of Mormons to this day. So they're one of the first pioneers to go out west in mass quantities in 1846. And the community becomes very prosperous. They're very good at what they do in creating a town. And the Mormons, hold on, they start Brigham Young University, and before Mormons didn't, this is a joke as well, before Mormons didn't believe in caffeine, they thought that it was a drug like akin to nicotine or something like that, so they didn't have soda on their campus, but just like 2 years ago, they allowed soda for Brigham Young University students, so that's just some pop culture. But their polygamous culture, their polygamy laws, they kind of around the turn of the century in 1900, will get rid of polygamy because Utah is not allowed to be a state if within their constitution they write in polygamy is legal. So, and polygamy is one man marrying multiple wives, by the way. So they kind of get rid of polygamy like on the down low. And as a result, in 1896, they're given their statehood and Utah becomes a state. All right, so the Second Great Awakening sparks so many reforms. And the reason that it sparks reform is we've got people in churches that are trying to explore their faith. And many of these different denominations, these many different faiths are saying faith through good works. And they want a path to salvation. They want a path to bring people to salvation. They want a path to make the world better. And many of them find that path through reform movements like women's rights, prohibition, and abolition. So it does make a switch from religion to social reform. We've got more people involved in the social sphere in churches. In the political sphere, voting, we've got more women involved in the Second Great Awakening, and we've got Christians wanting to insert good works into their faith and looking for an avenue in which to do that. One of the first major reform issues is anti-alcoholism, sometimes called prohibition. So, the crusade against alcohol kind of began during this time period because alcohol abuse was pretty rampant, and abusers were not only men. There were women and clergymen and members of Congress that were alcoholics. It affected their work life and their home life. It was dangerous to work in these new factories during the Industrial Revolution if you're drunk or hungover, and it was dangerous to be at home and I mean, it's always dangerous to be drunk. And so we get the first little organization of anti-alcohol people is called the American Temperance Society. And it was formed in Boston around the 1820s. And within a few years, it grows to a collection of lots of local groups. And they urge anti-alcohol. They urge drinkers to give up alcohol. They organize children's clubs. Think like you did DARE when you were little in elementary school. It's kind of like, that's anti-drugs. This is like anti-alcohol education in schools and in churches. And there are two major strategies in the early battles against alcohol. Temperance would be the idea that we need to moderately use alcohol rather than just give it up completely. Let's not drink to get drunk. If you're going to drink, just drink to enjoy the taste of it, kind of. Just drink moderately. Or drink on special occasions. And then legal reform or abstinence completely from alcohol would be the idea that the government needs to legalize this moral reform and prohibit alcohol. And some states do it, but for the most part, it fails. And then we will get to a time period in American history in the 1920s where this movement grows and grows and grows and grows and grows to the point where there is a national amendment that bans the sale, manufacture, and use of alcohol. And that amendment fails miserably, and then it will be repealed. All right. So the sphere of reform in women's rights in the 1840s. It's not like women's right to vote yet, but we're getting there, okay? So when we're talking about women's rights, we have to look at the gender differences of the time. The belief was in separate spheres. So I ask you, what are separate spheres? It's the idea that women were seen, or women's place in that time period's mind was to be, her sphere was at home. And her sphere was to educate children and to cook, clean, take care of the home, sometimes even take care of finances. So they had a large role, but it wasn't allowed to be a public role. And then the idea of what role did mothers play in society, write down the word Republican motherhood. And we've talked about this before, that women were seen as keepers of society's education and conscience with a special responsibility to teach children how to be good and productive citizens. But isn't that a slap in the face? It's good for you to be educated women, but only to educate your babies, not to better yourselves or to enter into the public sphere. So that's kind of the basis. That's the context of what we're heading into when we talk about women's rights. We've got a few women's crusaders at the time, female reformers advocating women's suffrage and increased rights for women. And it kind of They also end up participating in the general reform movements, temperance and abolition and getting rid of slavery, those reform movements as well. So 3 girls right here. Lucretia Mott organizes women's rights conventions, such as Seneca Falls that we're going to talk about. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you've probably heard her name before. She urges equality for women, legal equality. That includes the right to sue, the right to a divorce, the right to own property. At this time period, if a man, a dad died and only had daughters, the property would go to the closest male relative, not the daughters, unless they were married. And so she wants females to have the right to own property. If a woman did own property somehow, if she got married, that property was transferred to her husband's name. And so that is a major right that women didn't have during this time period. Elizabeth Cady Stanton fought for that. And then Susan B. Anthony is a Quaker. She's kind of the protege of Stanton. She's kind of like her understudy in a sense. And she was a fantastic orator. She was very good at speaking. And so she helped organize a lot of these campaigns and rallies, and she would speak at them. Okay, a few more. Angelina and Sarah Grimke were actually Southern sisters. So they both were born on a plantation to a white landowner, very rich, and they saw the horrors of slavery and spoke out against them. They move up to New England where they can get a little bit more ground when it comes to what they're speaking, and they're very fierce speakers. They're at first against slavery and then later in favor of women's rights. And Sarah is a powerful writer, and they kind of team up together and write and hold a lot of like lectures on women's rights and abolition. And then Lucy Stone helped organize the first women's rights convention. She was an abolitionist. And one thing very interesting about her is she got married, but she kept her maiden name, which was like very taboo at the time. And so women who did the same thing in her stead afterward, kept their maiden name, were sometimes called Lucy Stoners. All right, one more that I just love because it's hilarious. Amelia Bloomer. She popularized the wearing of shorter skirts with trousers underneath and not like leggings, but very, very loose and baggy pants called bloomers. And they were called bloomers named after her. And so she's basically like just trying to convey that she should be able to wear what she wants, and she should be able to wear pants because it's so much easier to operate in pants. And as you can see in the actual picture and the artist rendition, it's not that much easier to walk in, but it's a statement that she's making. And so those pants are now called bloomers. All right, so the big like paramount feature of women's rights in the early 1800s is the Seneca Falls Convention, and this is in New York, also just known as a women's rights convention. It's organized by Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and at this convention, they write something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And in this Declaration of Sentiments, they essentially take the Declaration of Independence and twist it and rewrite it so it is women declaring independence from society norms. And the first line is all men and women are created equal. And it has grievances and it sounds like the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to go through it in class. And some of these grievances are divorce issues, property issues, the right to vote, the right to have a voice, the right to be out in public, those sort of things. And what's really influential about this is it's the first women's rights event. It launches a modern women's rights movement. There are 61 women there and 34 men. One of those men is Frederick Douglass, a very well-known abolitionist at the time. And the issue here is that the women's rights movement gains a lot of momentum, and then boom, the Civil War happens, and it's just not on people's minds anymore. It's overshadowed by the events of the Civil War. And so we will get a further reaching, a more successful women's rights movement after the turn of the next century in the 1900s. All right, education reform. Let's talk public education. So public education, there's a big push for free public tax-supported schools. And we're going to see that happening a lot more in New England and in the West than in the South, but it does start to happen in the South. And part of the reason is that whole Jackson era manhood suffrage thing, where people are now involved in politics and they want the government to help them as well, and they're going to give their voice. So we will get more tax supported free public education. Horace Mann is key to reform for better education because he establishes what's called normal schools. And normal schools is like a teacher college. And actually, the school I went to, EKU, was started as a normal school. And his idea was we need to train teachers and send them out to start schools and fund those schools. And then that generation will teach the next generation and they'll want to go be a teacher. And it'll be like a cycle. Noah Webster wasn't a teacher or anything, but he was very interested in language and he wrote a dictionary, Webster's Dictionary, right? He helped standardize American English. And he also wrote readers and grammar books. And readers are like, they would tell, William McGuffey, the next person, wrote readers as well. And they're like common textbooks that were pretty cheap to buy. And it would tell stories while teaching kids how to read. And the stories would be about faith and morality and patriotism and sharing and idealism and like good things. So we're teaching them lessons while we're teaching them how to read. And here's an example. So lesson number 1, here's a really easy thing to read. Here's John. They are John and Ann. Ann has a new book. And then this one is all about they're all playing together nicely. And it teaches you some words before, and then you read through it. And there's a McGuffey's reader. My dad actually has a set of McGuffey's readers. Okay, so we can't talk about education reform without talking about higher education or college. So because of the Second Great Awakening, we do have some small denominational liberal arts colleges or faith-based colleges pop up throughout the United States, kind of like in the First Great Awakening, like Harvard and all those colleges were started for religious reasons. Women's schools and secondary education kind of gained some respectability in the 1800s. Some women's schools and like female seminaries are faith-based. Some of them are called finishing schools, where after you finish grade school, you go to this women's school and they teach you how to like host a party and have great posture and like things sew and embroider and things that women need to know to run a home. But Oberlin College was open to both men and women, and eventually they will be one of the first colleges that accepts free blacks as well. And then we've got this idea called lyceums. And lyceums are traveling lecturers in science, literature, moral philosophy, social studies. And they're just kind of like lecturers that are sponsored, and they go around to different towns and hold lectures, and people are very interested in them because a lot of people don't have the opportunity to learn, because some of them can't read or can't read well or don't have access to education or access to books. Public libraries aren't really a thing yet, especially in small towns. And so these lecturers come around and it's someone talking and they can understand that. It's very interesting. Remember, they don't have the internet. They can't just look things up. They don't have TV. They can't learn via media. They have to learn through other people if they can't read and write or just don't have access to that. So traveling lecturers were very popular. All right, a small little diversion here into prison and mental health reform. During this time period, people with mental and physical disabilities were not handled in a fair way. They were often seen as mentally ill or crazy and put into asylums, even if it was just a slight mental disability or a learning disability. They were kept in squalid conditions. They were put in poorhouses. They were held in basements. Sometimes they were kept in chains, and there was just no mental health reform. And so one woman, especially Dorothea Dix, was a nurse, and she was a nurse during the Civil War, and she she worked to improve the treatment of mentally disabled and physically disabled. She traveled around some 60,000 miles in 8 years, and she reported on the squalid conditions from firsthand experiences of where mentally and physically disabled people were kept. Um, and she wanted to shift the notion in their heads that mentally ill people chose that to they didn't choose that. They are mentally ill, it is not their fault. Kind of like if you get sick, it's not your fault. Um, so she wants to improve conditions and gain a concept that it's not their fault, so we need to treat them fairly and maybe their condition can improve. And so hospitals and reform asylums were built as a result, to help, like, I guess, help provide for the mentally and physically disabled. All right. All right, so wilderness utopias here. Inspired by the Second Great Awakening, it's people who want reform, people who want to change things, but they think that regular society is not good enough and they're going to move out and try and start their own little religion or community, okay? So let's discuss some of these. Brook Farm is one of the most famous. Brook Farm is in Massachusetts, started in 1841 by 20 intellectuals, and they come together and they say, plain living. So we're going to live simply and high thinking. We're going to think and philosophize. That's not a real word. And write and paint and things like that. And they're prospering for a while, but their community building burns down. Nathaniel Hawthorne, actually the author of The Scarlet Letter, worked there. And the idea was that this is going to be a working farm where we all work equally, we all think and have discussions, we all share equally, and we're just going to live in this community. But the issue is smart people often can't cut it in, like intellectual high-class thinkers often can't cut it out in the wild. And so Brook Farm kind of like fades into oblivion as people realize they can't really farm that well. The Oneida colony, founded in New York, was a little bit more radical. They interpreted the Bible to mean that free love, sometimes they call it complex marriage, where we're all married to each other, was allowed. And they practiced birth control methods, which was taboo for the time. They wanted to practice eugenics, which is like selective breeding, the selection of parents to provide superior offspring. So like, you are smart and good looking, you are smart and good looking. How about you guys make babies for our colony? So weird, right? And they believed that everyone was married to each other in spirit. And so all of the children belong to all of us and we take care of them. They also believed in equality of the genders. So male and female had the same work, had the same spheres. And they actually will continue for over 30 years, largely due to their steel making and their silver plates, Oneida plates. They made them in their beautiful silver plates that you put up in a china cabinet. All right, the Shakers. Shakers are close to home for us. We have a Shaker village over past Harrodsburg, and it's very beautiful. Now, there aren't any Shakers left there, but all the buildings are there, and they're very interesting to look at. Their actual name is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, and they're established in New York, but they have these little denominations kind of everywhere in Pennsylvania and Kentucky, and they're kind of communists in a way. They all work. They believe in the divvying out of money to make everyone equal. They have big religious communities. They oppose marriage, and they oppose the Oneidas and the free love ideas. And they lived in separate houses. So the women lived on one side and the men lived on the other, and they worked together, but they didn't interact in any way. They even went to separate church services. They had separate doors into buildings. So men would go in one door and women would go in the other door. But because they opposed marriage and free love, it led to their extinction because they didn't have babies. So they adopted people into the Shaker Society, but or they adopted orphans, or they converted people. But in the 1940s, they kind of basically all die out. The last Shaker at Pleasant Village around Harrodsburg was in the late 30s, in the 1930s, and There are a few Shakers left that had been adopted by members in the 1940s. I think there's like 2 in Pennsylvania, but most of Shaker communities are still there, and you can go learn about them, even though there are no Shakers. All right, let's talk about the changing American family here. Gender roles are obviously changing. Women are growing more conscious of themselves. They want to be more involved in the public sphere and less in just the home sphere. So it's still a man's world, but women are faring a little bit better through these increased roles in the church and reform movements. And some women are actually working. And most women that are working, and it's a small amount, are working as school teachers or in domestic service. And then some women in cities are working in those like mills and factories where women went and lived, like a community-based work system, okay? We get this idea of the cult of domesticity. If women were working, many of them left their jobs when they got married and stayed at home. And the cult of domesticity is a cultural idea that just glorifies women who stay home, the traditional function of the homemaker, where they have, it's again, this slap in the face kind of. You have immense moral power and you can make big decisions for the home that alter the character of the family itself, but you have to stay home. So the life of a young woman might be working on a farm for her parents or in a factory from a working age, or stay home or go to finishing school if she's upper class. Then she would get married and all those things go away. And she stays home and she has children and she takes care of the home and maybe takes care of the finances, but that's it. And some women don't like this. Obviously, the women fighting for women's rights are not a fan that this is the cultural norm. Now, we do have some families changing here. The idea of the family, in a sense, that arranged marriages are kind of dying out and people more determine their choice of spouse, mostly still from their social class. And families are growing smaller because back in the day, people used to have lots of kids so they could work the farm. But now we've got more urbanization and more people doing like artistry or shops or working in factories. So we don't need as many children. We don't need as many mouths to feed. And so we're slowly becoming a more modern family. In 1800, the average family had 6 kids. The average family had 6 kids. That means that most families were having much more than 6 kids. Nowadays, the average family has 2 or 3 kids, okay? And let's talk arts. Arts. There's lots of artistic achievement during this time period. People are feeling themselves and American culture, okay? So America is getting its own artistic expression, in a sense. Gilbert Stuart, he is the author of one of the best American painters of the era, drew several portraits of Washington, all somewhat like immoralized, like Washington is so great, okay? We've got the Hudson River Art School, Hudson River School of Art. And this is like an emphasized romantic mirroring of American landscapes. It is taking parts of America and just beautifying them in this art and hallowing it and making America seem so extremely beautiful and full of opportunity and full of wonder. And so it's kind of like worshiping America in a sense with the landscapes, okay? John James Audubon is very well known for his science in art and drawing of many different bird species and publishing books of many different American bird species. And then Louis Daguerre. This is a big one. The daguerreotype is the first sort of photography, and it's a very involved process. I might show you guys in class. It's with smoke and mirrors, basically, and mercury, and you have to chemically treat it and rinse it and dry it and seal it behind a glass. But it's the first sort of photography that we have. And he's a Frenchman, and he creates it. And actually the first photograph president, he wasn't president at the time, was John Quincy Adams. And there he is using a daguerreotype method. And they're very small, and sometimes they put them in necklaces. It was very difficult to take pictures during this time period. It's a new art that will become a little bit more stable in the Civil War. So we'll actually have pictures of the Civil War. Okay, Stephen Foster was a very famous American musician, and he's very famous in Kentucky because he wrote the song My Old Kentucky Home and the Florida State song Swanee River. But the thing about Stephen Foster, even though I love his music, I love the musical about him called The Stephen Foster Story. My Old Kentucky Home is one of my favorite songs. He's kind of a controversial figure because he stole a lot of his tunes and the words from slave songs. They called them darky tunes, and he capitalized on slave art and made money off of it. Now, he wasn't super rich or anything, but he was taking Black culture from the time and turning it into white culture. And the song My Old Kentucky Home, if you listen to the lyrics and you listen to the verses that they don't sing at the Derby, it's all about slaves wanting to go home. My Old Kentucky Home is about a slave being sold down south where slavery is harder, and them wanting to go back up to the upper south, my old Kentucky home, where slavery wasn't as harsh. That's our state song. That's the state song. And they used to, in our state song, they officially changed the words to the old folks are gay, so the old folks are happy. In the actual tune, it's supposed to say the darkies are gay, the slaves are happier in Kentucky. So it kind of has a dark past and a dark history, even though it is a beautiful song. All right, literature. Before this time period, most Americans just import stuff from Europe. During this time period, after that pro-America, woohoo, we beat the British, we don't want anything to do with European literature and culture. It inspires American authors to start writing, okay? Transcendentalism. I'm flying right now. Transcendentalism is this idea. It's not a reform movement. It's not a community, but it kind of becomes those things. It emerges in New England, and it's the idea that truth, we need to find truth, and truth transcends the senses. It cannot be found by study. It cannot be found by religion. And instead, everyone kind of has an inner light that illuminates the highest truth to them and puts them in touch with God if only they can find that light within themselves. And it really stresses individualism in social and religious spheres. I am important. I can transcend into a different way of thinking that is above everyone else. And in this way, it becomes hostile to formal institutions like religious churches and any type of education or conventional wisdom, because it's all about how the self can find those things, okay? And we've got some transcendentalists that are important. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a fantastic poet, a great philosopher, all about nature. He stressed self-reliance and improving yourself and looking forward to the future and freedom of thought. And how all that can be found in nature. Henry David Thoreau was kind of mystic and mysterious. He was a nonconformist. He moved away from regular society. He was a poet, and he believed that the institution, the government, these people are anti-government in a sense because they're against institutions. He believed that that we need to fight against the wrong in the world once you find your inner light, once you transcend into the truth. He wrote Walden, or A Life in the Woods, all about like breaking away from society and living on your own and finding truth that way. He wrote an essay on civil disobedience. He was put in jail when he didn't pay his taxes because he didn't want to support the Mexican War effort. And it's all about how we can disobey the government civilly in order to protest. And actually, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. kind of look at this essay when they're crafting their nonviolence civil rights movements, okay? Walt Whitman writes Leaves of Grass. He's a transcendentalist. He's a fantastic poet. In my personal opinion, they drag on forever, and I don't enjoy reading them. And then we've got some writers that go into a darker sense of transcendentalism. They're not looking for optimism and truth and transcending. They're trying to juxtapose how hypocritical people are. Okay, so Edgar Allan Poe writes very dark. He is an individual, but he's dissenting against this, everything's fine, good feelings kind of era. And he writes very, very dark things in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. He's a very gifted lyrical poet. The Raven is one of my favorite stories. The Telltale Heart is one of my favorite stories. And it's all about terror and darkness, okay? And so he's exploring the world of dark emotions that no one wants to talk about. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter. He rejects these Calvinist Puritan ideas and the never-ending struggle between good and evil. And he just shows how obsessed people are with sin in religion. And in The Scarlet Letter, I mean, the female is banished from the town for having an illegitimate child. And it's kind of like a if you've ever read The Scarlet Letter, the end is a big twist, and it's all about why are people so obsessed with sin. And then Herman Melville, Moby Dick, about whale oil and killing a whale. It lashed out against popular optimism. It's so depressing. So that's kind of what these writers were doing. All right, journalism is rising as well. The newspaper is bolstered. More people are reading, more people are writing, more people are learning. We get journalism that's all about scandal and murders and human interest, and like people love to read that stuff in the newspaper. But we also see, now that more people are learning to read and write, we see that newspapers will start being campaign ads as well. They will spout politics and try and sway public opinion. There will be editorials and things like that because they know that's how we can reach people. That's the newest media. All right, and that's it. Thank you so much for learning about reform and culture with me.